Hi, everyone. Welcome in. We're going to give everybody just a couple minutes to jump on and get settled here in Zoom. All right, we have a tight 30 minutes today, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to kick us off. Welcome to Introduction to Greenhouse Gas Accounting. My name is Alicia Schmidt, and I'm the VP of Member Impact here at Pledge 1%. If you are not familiar with Pledge 1%, very simply, it's a global movement that inspires, educates, and empowers every company to leverage its assets to be a force for good. You can find out more about us at our website, which is listed here, pledge1%.org. That's all one word there. And this session is actually part of our Igniting Impact series of webinars intended to be 30-minute, very focused, quick hits of information that you can take action on today. We cover a wide range of topics from supporting your company's ESG and sustainability goals to impact measurement to standing up a product donation program, which is actually the topic of our next webinar, which is happening tomorrow. So please check that out if you can. Now, before I hand over the webinar to our featured speaker today, just a quick set of house rules. We love your dog, your kids, your birds, your partner, but we don't want them to accidentally interrupt our speakers. So everyone's going to be on mute today during the webinar. You can add comments or questions in the chat. You can also use the Q&A function. We're going to try and answer the questions at the end of the presentation, but if you have something that's burning, you have to know right away, please go ahead and put it in the chat or the Q&A function featured window. We're also going to send out a recording of this webinar to all registrants, and OnePointFive is generously going to share a copy of the slides to the registrants as well. So keep an eye out for that. And finally, it's important that you stick around until the end of the session. We just have a quick poll that we would love you to take just to make sure that we can continue to improve our program and delivery. Again, questions go in the Q&A or the Q&A box or in the chat. So I'm really excited today to introduce our speaker, Yeoh. So Yeoh is the founder and CEO of OnePointFive, which is a Forbes Next 1000 awarded climate advisory and academy with more than 700 sustainability professionals across 45 countries. Yeoh is a climate thought leader sharing sustainability practitioner insights to nearly 15,000 LinkedIn followers to help them level up their knowledge and competencies. And prior to OnePointFive, Yeoh was a climate startup mentor to 500 startups, Plug and Play, and Yale University's Center for Business and the Environment. He was also deputy director at Echoing Green, managing a climate investment fund and post-investment support. He reviewed 2,000 plus climate start applications and invested in and advised 70 climate startups across 20 countries. Whew, I'm out of breath just getting through this one. Yeoh has written for Forbes and the WEF on innovative climate solutions and startup investing. He was listed as a 40 under 40 most influential Asian Australian in 2022 for global climate impact, and has been invited to speak on business and environmental topics at the United Nations and at Oxford, Harvard, Yale, New York, and Princeton universities. Very impressive, Yeoh. We're so happy to have you, and I'm going to let you take it away from here.
All right. Thank you so much, Alicia and team. You've set me a challenge, 20 minutes to go through greenhouse gas accounting. Warning ahead of time, this is definitely going to be drinking from the fire hose, but I'm sure that you'll get a green skill out of this. And as Alicia mentioned, we will share you the slides. So don't worry about taking notes vigorously. So let's just hop straight into it. So the first thing is just to understand global warming as a whole.
Sorry.
So many of Yes.
Sorry, Yeoh, you just need to share your screen real quick. We just transitioned slides here.
Okay. Gosh. All right. Give me. No, it's showing up on my side. Is it not sharing on your end?
Oh, yep. There we go.
Okay, good. Got it. Great. So when it comes to greenhouse gases, the first thing for you to know is that the sun brings short form radiation down into the Earth's surface. And we have this blanket, which is greenhouse gases. You might know it from carbon dioxide, but there's also other greenhouse gases that we'll cover. And basically what's happened is the more and more we've added pollution into the air in terms of greenhouse gases, that blanket, it's like putting on a thicker blanket. We eventually get warm. And so rather than our planet being a Goldilocks planet, we're starting to warm, and that's creating a lot of impact. And where does this come from? Well, there are a ton of different sources for greenhouse gases. Not only is it the CO2 emitted by the fossil fuel industry, but it's the air transportation. It's even methane from landfills to the thawing of the permafrost, which is the melting of ice caps that then create more heat that is captured in our society, as well as even from our dietary areas and industrial processes. And so this is a breakdown I just wanted to share, like from IPCC, which is the International Climate side of United Nations. We know that the reason why we talk about carbon footprint, carbon dioxide, is because it's the most prominent greenhouse gas out there. However, there are many other greenhouse gases, including methane, which comes from different areas of landfill, to the burps of cows, to industrial processes, as well as nitrous, which can come from the food and agriculture sector, mostly through fertilizers and other modes. And it's important to know this because when it comes to greenhouse gases, they're not all equal. In terms of the lifetime of them, just imagine this, like our great grandparents, the emissions that they had when they were alive are still some of the emissions that we would have from carbon dioxide. That's crazy. So the emissions that we emit today will be felt for generations to come. And so this just shows the importance of not only the lifetime that these greenhouse gases end up in the atmosphere, but additionally, the global warming potential. Carbon dioxide may warm the atmosphere, say by 1 factor, but methane and nitrous can be anywhere from 200 to 300 times higher global warming potential, meaning it warms higher than carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So we can't forget that it's confluence of it all. But what is net zero anyway? And I think a lot of people have been talking about net zero, like how do we do something about it? Well, as organizational leaders, there is a pathway that we can take, which helps us to lead the charge of reducing the greenhouse gas emissions, but also gaining a value creation from doing the right work. And the way that it works is a simple scale. On the scale on the left, you can see that there are greenhouse gas emissions that are weighing down. Then you have removals that are on the right. And ideally, over time, we're trying to reduce our emissions and increase our removals to the point of which we have a balance, where there's a balance of what we're emitting to what we're removing. And so the main thing that you got to remember if you think about net zero is that we need to reduce emissions by 45% or half by 2030 from 2010 levels and reach net zero by 2050, which is what a lot of organizations are pledging. But why should you care? Well, the first one that's driving a lot of it is a rising tide of legislation. If you're in the US, if you're in EU, even if you're beyond EU and the US, there is a lot more regulation that's coming down. And that's why I think everyone should understand what greenhouse gas accounting is, that I'm going to be teaching you shortly, because whether you're a company that's small in the global South to larger organizations, this is the issue that we need to cover, because your scope 3 is likely someone else's scope 1 and 2, and you'll kind of clearly see this soon. And so whether it's now or later, a lot of people are waking up. But it's not just about compliance. Executives, and this is a Morgan Stanley 2024 report, ideally show that there has been value creation, climate risk, and climate investments that are key. Executives consider sustainability to be a value creation, will impact their business, and they know that they need to invest into it. And so this is the importance of embedding sustainability. And I think this is a recent playbook, and Michelle will share you the link, but we have a playbook on how do you actually lead with embedding sustainability into your climate workforce. And you can see here that getting a green skill can propagate throughout the organization over time as you start to learn a lot more. Not everyone needs to be a greenhouse gas accounting expert, but if you can see, by embedding sustainability, not only will it add to top line revenue growth, 16% higher, it also allows you to outperform your peers by 52%, and you actually get attribute operating cost reductions. And I think this is key, right? Sustainability sometimes is pulled into the CSR play, but if you think about it, reducing the amount of energy, resources, and water that you use reduces your bottom line, and it also allows you to be a steward of climate. And we know for a fact, and this is from Project Drawdown, the leading think tank for climate action, that we need millions of workers. It's no longer a nice to have, but a must have. So if you think about it, Lean Six Sigma, some of you might know that, or PMP certification, CPA, CFAs, at one time it used to be a nice to have to be a process engineer or to learn project management. But we realized over many years that it should be part of everyone's job. And I'm going to try to convince you that green skills like greenhouse gas accounting is important for any role, regardless of whether you're in the sustainability team or not. So how does an organization start on net zero? By measuring your baseline greenhouse gas emissions. And I hope by the end of this short sprint, you'll at least get a guidance of how to think about this. And where does this content come from? Well, it first of all, we'll cover scope 1, 2, 3, and we'll do calculations. This is part of our process to help organizations get through it. And the content comes from our OnePointFive Academy, which you can find on our site, opf.degree/academy. If you're interested in this, we run an 8-week boot camp that is applicable for full-time staff. If you also have team members that want to take this or yourself, you should definitely check it out. We have a cohort in October and a cohort next year in March, and we're happy to obviously provide discounts to the pledge 1% for the strong applicants that we have, given that you already have gotten started on this journey. So GHG accounting, it quantifies the impact of an organization. The best way that I define this is it's like financial accounting. So for anyone that's familiar with financial accounting from the business side, GHG accounting is pretty similar. It's an annual statement, and it helps us to quantify the impact of our organization's business activities. And the whole point is that if you can't measure it, you can't reduce it. And I think a lot of organizations are realizing now it's not just about recycling or, employee engagement, especially with 1/3 of the workforce being Gen Z by 2030, and a lot of them living and breathing by their values and knowing that they're inheriting a world that is burning. It is really important that we help these employees understand that an organization can measure and reduce its emissions through the process of GHG accounting. So where does this come from? Well, if you end up wanting to read more, the GHG protocol is where the majority of standards have been built. So if you just Google GHG protocol, you can find everything and more of what I said. It's just hundreds of pages. And so sometimes it's difficult for people to sift through, but it basically gives you a step-by-step approach of how to do it. It may not be easy for you to digest, and this is why we run workshops like this, because we believe everyone should attain a skill, but it is the body of sustainability status that governs the GHG accounting space. And this is the diagram that we've all looked at in sustainability. Hopefully you become more and more familiar with this as you look deeper. And there's 3 scopes in how you measure an organization's greenhouse gas accounting. So in a simplified way, you have scope 1, which is your company facilities and your company vehicles, the things that you own. Then you have scope 2, which is that gray line, and that is your indirect emissions. And this is from your purchased electricity, steam, heat, cooling. And so like a lot of utility bills go into this. And then finally, you have scope 3, which is your upstream and downstream activities. And you can see there are 15 different categories. And the best way to describe scope 3 is your value chain or supply chain emissions. That's where more than 90% of emissions can lie for most companies. And it sometimes is the most difficult to measure because you're having to survey suppliers. But it's a combination of these 3 things that allow you to basically build a GHG accounting statement. Now, if we break it down, you probably have figured this out by now, but scope 1 is the easiest to calculate because you probably have information on your facilities and vehicles. Scope 2 is a tiny bit harder because maybe you need to get your utility bills, your energy, heat, steam, and cooling. And then scope 3 becomes the hardest, but the biggest area of impact, which is suppliers to the use of sold products, to your capital investments. And we'll go through each of these one by one. But basically, to bring it to life, everyone knows Google. We use probably Google on a daily basis. This is Google's 2022 greenhouse gas inventory. You can see how it's split between scopes 1 and 2 and a bunch of scope 3. So this is what a greenhouse gas statement looks like. It's kind of like a financial statement, but it has, instead of the number and the dollar figures, it literally has this tons of CO2 equivalent. And CO2 equivalent is the roll up of all the greenhouse gases into an equivalency of like an overarching thing. So you multiply it by the global warming potential to get the statement. And it's really important because not only is it showing you where emissions are, but it also helps you to know where to take action. Like, where is Google's emissions? We're going to answer that question after I teach you a bit more. And if you look at it from a pie chart, you can see that the majority of emissions come from scope 3. And what is 10.2 million tons of CO2 anyway? That's the equivalency of Google's 2022 organizational emissions. Well, you can see equivalency across here. It's 2.3 million gasoline-powered cars driven for a year, 1.3 million homes energy used for a year, or even 2.7 coal-fired power plants. It's not an insignificant amount of footprint. And even within that, you can start to break them down to go, okay, what is that light blue chart that's showing that big thing? Like, where is Google's emissions? Well, we're going to answer that question in a little bit. And it helps you guide where you can have an outsized impact, not only on the climate, but get a return on investment through doing the right thing. And if we look at it across different sectors, this is a great diagram that not only one shows here on the left chart in the orange bars, the scope 1 and 2 emissions across different sectors from energy all the way to real estate. And you might notice a trend that one, the majority of emissions land within those blue bars, which is scope 3 downstream and upstream, versus the orange bars, which are scope 1 and 2. But there's also absolute differences in different industries. So it wouldn't be a surprise that the energy sector is right up there because fossil fuels generate a lot of emissions, especially from the use of products, which is the burning of the actual fossil fuel. But there's also an absolute difference as you go down in different organizations. Now, mind you that all organizations sometimes are misled to think, oh, I don't have emissions because I'm a services business, or, we only deal with healthcare. I can tell you that there are emissions and you would be surprised, and you can have an outsized impact, whether you're a public, private company, small or big, and you can apply the same process. And here is the 5-step process for greenhouse gas calculation process, from identifying sources, collecting data, applying emission factors to calculating. And so we'll be sending you this takeaway slide in a tiny bit for you to be able to look through this in order for you to be able to get through it. Here's how you set a greenhouse gas inventory boundary. And this is the 3 steps that you need to think about. First of all is a temporal boundary. The first thing is, are you measuring this on a calendar year or a fiscal year? And this is just like, taxes, where are we kind of doing January to February, or do we have a different fiscal year? So it kind of lines up pretty well with your financial accounting. The second thing that you would want to look at is whether you measure it from an equity share approach or a controlled approach. And we'll go through this in a tiny bit, but these are how you generate GHG inventories for more complex and larger businesses. You might have subsidiaries where you have a percentage ownership, and therefore you would only have a percentage ownership of those emissions. And then finally, there are the operational boundaries that we just covered. So are you covering scope 1, 2, and scope 3? How many categories of scope 3 are you covering? Some organizations only choose to do scope 1 and 2. Some only choose to do some elements of scope 3. And so when it comes to scope 1, the first thing to notice is your direct emissions, which are your operations of owned and controlled vehicles and also facilities. So you have your stationary combustion, which can be boilers or furnaces. You can have your mobile combustion, which are like company-owned or leased vehicles. The fugitive emissions, which are really important. You probably know that refrigerant leaks cause a lot to greenhouse gas emissions from hydrofluorocarbons that you just saw before. But you also have process emissions. So this is kind of where scope 1 lands. This is where you're identifying your ownership of vehicles and facilities, as well as refrigerants on site. The second scope is the purchase electricity, heat, and steam. And there are 2 methods that you can do accounting for. One is location-based, which is using your average emissions intensity of your local grid. So just think about, when you're paying for your own utility bill as a household, right? On the one hand, you might get a general factor of where your electricity is coming from. And anyone that's energy knows that it comes in electrons. So on the one hand, you want to sort of see roughly what the energy grid is, which location-based is a bit easier. Or if you have a bit more specific information from the utility provider that you had, you could do a market-based approach, which is specifically all the different supplier-based emission factors from the utility provider that you have. And so a lot of organizations choose to do a mix of both, depending on the availability of data. There is also arguments because depending on which method you use, it can create different outcomes, which has been a concern for the tech industry like Google, because especially with the rise of AI, we're going to be using a lot more electricity and scope 2 emissions are going to skyrocket. Some companies can actually still choose a more preferable method that reduces their emissions, still align with the GHG protocol, but can lead to greenwashing, in my opinion. And so this just shows that there's an importance to understand these different methods and to know what the implications are. And then finally, we have scope 3 emissions. Here you can split between just a value chain. So you can see on the left side, we have raw material suppliers and manufacturing. And mind you, you'll have access to these afterwards. And that includes, all these different elements. I'll just cover a couple of things like business travel, right? If you're flying a lot, this would be flowing into scope 3 emissions. So if you have a good travel policy that reduces emissions, this could be a great place to measure and reduce. You may also have the capital goods that you need to purchase for your products and services. This will fall into that. And so you might have a supplier scorecard to try to make sure when you're purchasing items from a supplier, you're doing it in the lowest carbon way possible. Then on the other side, you have downstream, which covers manufacturing, distribution, and consumers. So some examples would be use of sold products. This is kind of what I talked about. When a customer uses your products, like what ends up happening to the emissions, right? IKEA realized that the biggest emissions were when people actually utilize their furniture and the electricity, the lighting of their products. And I'll show you that shortly. Whereas where does your investments lie, right? A company can do very well, but perhaps be invested into the fossil fuel industry and other areas. And so this is where it flows into scope 3. And how you choose these scope 3 categories, because you don't need to go through all of them, would be to go to CDP, which is Climate Disclosure Project. And they actually show you different sectors and the different categories of material scope 3 measurement areas. Like it's really difficult to measure all 15. You probably don't want to measure all 15 because it's not all material. And this is like how you do it. And so what? Like, what does GHG accounting look? Well, let's take back the example of Google. So now that you know roughly what scope 1, 2, and 3 are, let's break it down. Did you know that the majority of Google's emissions lie from their actual consumer hardware, data centers, and construction? It's got nothing to do with you Googling online. Well, not nothing, but much less impact than perhaps the Google Home, the data centers, and probably even more so with AI coming. And so what that allows Google to do is to say, hey, we actually need to move to renewable energy to reduce the data center use, especially with AI. And as you look at the scope 2 emissions that might increase, that's the only way that we can then keep our net zero strategy alive. And I actually presented this to the Google community, and they were shocked because some software engineers didn't realize how much of your emissions were coming from where. And just with a tiny bit of knowledge, you can start to like look up your favorite company, even if your company has a scope 1, 2, 3, start to control F and find what I talked about, the different scope emissions. Where are the emissions of an organization, and are the sustainability strategies aligned with where the emissions are? Take another example. You have IKEA's carbon footprint, right? Would it surprise you that 52% of the footprint comes from the raw material of extracting and cutting down trees? Shouldn't surprise you. And that's allowed IKEA to focus more on reforestation solutions, as well as trying to extend the lifetime of their products and bringing back wood back into their products so that they're actually reducing what is a significant amount of emissions. And so with that, I know that that was a lot in a short amount of time, but I wanted to make time for a Q&A. If you want to know more, this is part of a very small snippet of our 8-week program where we go through this step by step to give you applied learning, believing that everyone should have a green skill. So with that, I'll pass it back to Alicia.
Yeah, thank you, Neil, and thank you for sharing all of your expertise and getting us started on this journey. If you have questions, go ahead and put them into the Q&A window or into the chat. I'm going to ask one because I kind of have a question to get us started here, but I'm curious, what are the common challenges that people might expect to run into as they do this work? What's like one or two of the things that are hardest for companies in doing this work?
No, yeah, I think one thing to just note is that greenhouse gas accounting is as mature as financial accounting was in 1930. And if anyone's in the business world for long enough, you know that there's been creative accounting that has happened in our financial systems for many times. So one is that we're in a situation where the greenhouse gas protocol is releasing its latest update, which is coming for scope 3 next year, whilst organizations are trying to act. So it's a bit of a moving way. So it's really important that you understand that baseline, but the baseline is slightly shifting. And so we need to keep, so that's one, is just learning and understanding the standard, knowing that it's maturing as we do it. But the second biggest thing is data collection. You probably may know that there are a lot of greenhouse gas platforms and softwares out there, and people kind of get a bit overwhelmed about what to choose. At the end of the day, you can very well not necessarily, you can do this yourself, which is one, but the real particular issue is that it's not a software issue, it's a data collection issue. And so what the best thing you can do is, whilst you're doing it the first time, is to set up protocols about what data to collect, or even better, understand where that data is stored so that you can help improve the process time and time again. So it is just a process that is kind of hard to do the first time, but gets easier over time.
So related to that, Michael had a question, are there popular software platforms that have been adopted
Yeah.
specifically for GHG accounting?
There is. And if I was to suggest to you, so one caveat to this is in order to use these platforms, you kind of need the skill. So this is one thing. I'd go back to this webinar or read that it's as hard. But recently, I know that Persephone, it's been one of the leading platforms. They just recently released a free scope 1, 2, and 3 calculator just like last week. So I would actually direct you there. There's also the Change Climate Project that has like a non-profit tool, which is much more cost effective that you can apply for, or even the free EPA tool. If you're here in the US, just look up EPA Scope 1, 2, 3 tool. And I'll be happy to answer questions because it's not a tooling problem as much as it is a skill set and knowledge challenge to know how to use them. So I'm more than happy to, I'm very active on LinkedIn. So if you want to connect with me, I'm happy to chat.
Great. And Sarah had a question, how can I learn more about the idea of infusing climate knowledge throughout organizations, as you mentioned towards the beginning?
Yeah, Michelle, maybe this is a good time to share exactly. Michelle just sent through at 12:11 and the Zoom chat. Click that top link. We just launched the Climate Workforce Playbook with LinkedIn. And it is about the whole, how does an organization start to upskill the climate workforce and where are the gaps, who should learn what? We put a lot of time and research into it. It's a free playbook. We'd love for you to download it and let us know your thoughts. But I think that's a great starting point. It's not everyone needs to be a greenhouse gas accountant, but how do you incentivize and challenge organizations to embed sustainability throughout the org? And yeah.
And Om had a question, does buying carbon credits by an organization affect the GHG accounting?
Yeah, that's a great question. The credit market, the quickest answer for me to tell you is that credits are coming under a bit of scrutiny because basically you shouldn't be buying 100% of carbon credits to offset all your emissions. Right now, the baseline is, I think, roughly about 10% to 20% of your baseline emissions of what you calculate from scope 1, 2, and or 3 can be offset by credits. But purchasing credits don't impact the measurement. They're more like, we know that there's just going to be residual emissions that we can't get rid of, and that's what the purpose is for them. They can't be an excuse just to buy credits and be business as usual. So hopefully that answers your question.
Thank you, Neil. Any other questions today? Go ahead and put it in the Q&A or the chat. We'll give you 1 or 2 more minutes here to ask any final questions. And while we're waiting for folks to enter any final questions, I'll just say thank you again, Neil, for sharing your expertise today and getting it done in 30 minutes. That's amazing. I will say that this is just meant to be the very beginning of your journey, learning about GHG accounting. So there'll be lots of resources coming your way as well from our friends at OnePointFive Academy. So Michelle has gone ahead and put up a poll. I'm going to say thank you to Neil. You can jump off if you'd like. We just put up a poll for everybody just to tell us how we did today. That just helps us with future programming. So appreciate it if you could just take a second and take that poll. Again, thank you all for joining us today. Check out one of our future Igniting Impact webinars, and we'll hope to see you all again. Thanks, Neil.